We need them for economic security.
I don't think that's what Trump has in mind, however. Try to not demonize Putin, keep the door open.
안녕하세요. 힘있는 이야기를 발굴하는 특종의 발견. 저는 김수영 기자입니다. 다음 주면 미국에서는 트럼프 대통령이 취임식을 갖고 본격적인 업무를 시작합니다. 취임 첫날부터 많은 정책을 쏟아낼 것으로 예상되는데 특히 벌써 3년 가까이 이어지고 있는 우크라이나 전쟁을 트럼프가 어떻게 끝낼 수 있을지 관심이 집중되고 있습니다. 이번 시간에는 나토 주재 미국 대사는 물론 트럼프 1기 정부에서 우크라이나 특별협상대표를 역임했던 커트 볼커와의 단독 인터뷰를 통해 트럼프 2기를 시작하면서 이번 전쟁이 어떻게 전개될지 정리해 보겠습니다. During his campaign, Trump pledged to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. Is this realistically achievable?
No. The war will not be ended in 24 hours. And even the person designated to become President Trump's special representative for Ukraine recently said in an interview that he's setting a target of 100 days. So they obviously understand that 24 hours is not realistic. Now, why is it not realistic? Why can't you end the war in 24 hours? And that is because Vladimir Putin wants to continue the war. He started this war. He is fighting this war. He believes that he can win this war. He wants to defeat Ukraine and take over the government and make Ukraine part of the Russian Empire. That's his goal, and he still thinks he can achieve it. So to convince him otherwise, to convince Putin that he can never achieve that goal, is going to require a show of strength, military support for Ukraine, sanctions against Russia, and a clear strategy about how we are going to block Putin so that he becomes convinced he has to just stop the war as it is and not try for more. To convince Russia to stop the war, you need to have enough force on the table to convince them that it's not worth continuing the fight. So his advisor for Ukraine, General Kellogg, as well as Trump himself, have talked about continuing military aid to Ukraine in one form or another.
And what does Trump envision as a solution to the war? And is it a possible plan?
I do think it's possible. And I think what Trump has in mind is a ceasefire in place. So nobody takes any more territory. You just stop the fighting where it is. And then Russia can claim to occupy this territory for the long term. No one's going to take it back militarily, but no one will recognize it as Russia's right to have this territory either. It'll be a de facto occupation, but not recognized. And in the meantime, everybody then works to strengthen Ukraine, the part of it that is still sovereign and independent. You strengthen that Ukraine as an independent, democratic European government, eventually part of the EU and part of NATO. And that will set the stage for Ukraine recovering its territory years and years down the road. I think that's what Trump has in mind, and I do think it is a realistic scenario.
Then can Zelensky accept a ceasefire proposal after already losing so much territory?
He has indicated in an interview with Sky News in December of last year that he understands that he cannot take back all of the territory that Russia has seized militarily. They don't have the military means to do that. So he's prepared to accept a disagreement. Russia occupies part of Ukraine. No one recognizes it as part of Russia, and yet they will pursue the return of that territory not by military means, but by diplomatic and political and other means. I think that is a realistic scenario even for Ukraine.
In Ukraine, Trump's approval ratings have risen significantly while Biden's have declined. Despite extensive military aid, why is Biden's approval falling in Ukraine?
The Biden administration was seen in Ukraine as never providing enough support. They would provide some assistance, a great deal of assistance really, but they would never say the goal was for Ukraine to win or for Russia to be defeated. They restricted the types of weapons that were provided over time. They restricted the use of the weapons, even of those that were provided. So there's a great deal of skepticism in Ukraine about the Biden administration because it just seemed to be a slow death, enough to survive, but not enough to win. Trump is completely different. And I think Ukrainians look at Trump as being decisive. So where there is a clear goal and a way of achieving that goal, I think Trump will actually do it.
You know, Trump has shown an affinity for strongman. What is the actual nature of Trump's relationship with Putin?
It's a good question because there's a lot that's discussed in the media and in opinion pieces about Trump having this affection for Putin. But the reality is very different in my view. I think that Trump's style is to avoid demonizing the people he has to negotiate with. Just with Kim Jong-un, for example, he talked about these love letters that he sent to Kim Jong-un. That was a way of creating a relationship so that he could negotiate, while implementing pretty tough policies underneath that to try to shape the reality that Kim Jong-un was facing. He did the same thing with Russia. He lifted the arms embargo on Ukraine. He went after the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He closed down the Russian consulate in San Francisco. He threw out a lot of Russian intelligence officers from New York and Washington. He had a number of tough policies toward Putin while trying to keep the door open to talking. And I think that's what he's going to do going forward as well. Try to not demonize Putin, keep the door open, but have a number of tough policies in place underneath that.
And Trump and Kim Jong-un are known to have a personal rapport. How do you think their relationship might impact the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think this has to start over. I think that Trump worked very hard to establish a rapport with Kim Jong-un in order to try to get Kim Jong-un to give up nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un refused. He insisted on maintaining the nuclear program. And President Trump was very disappointed in this. This is all back in the first term. So now going forward, I think they're going to have to reestablish some kind of relationship if there's to be any relationship at all.
President Trump have shown intentions to annex Greenland and the Panama Canal. In the U.S. demonstrates such territorial ambitions, wouldn't it be difficult to dissuade Russia from trying to annex Ukraine?
It's a very interesting point. I've seen others also make the point that Trump, by claiming a sphere of influence in North America, where we have a right to Panama, we have a right to Canada, we have a right to Greenland, that somehow justifies Putin saying that he has a right to Ukraine. I hear that, I see it, I understand the analogy. I don't think that's what Trump has in mind, however. I think what Trump is trying to say is that there are issues with resources and issues with security. I do not believe there is any serious intent to try to annex Greenland or Canada or Panama. But Trump is using this device of claiming these territories as a way to get people talking about what the real issues are.
Then how do you think about the possibility of using military power? Do you think he might actually resort to force?
I don't. No, I really don't. One of the things that President Trump has bragged about during his campaign is that he was one of the few presidents since World War II who didn't start a war somewhere. He points to Biden, he points to Obama, he points to Bush, and he says, I never started a war. So I don't think he actually wants to use military force in any way like this at all.
How do you foresee this war ultimately being resolved?
The key building blocks to me in 2025 seem to be a ceasefire in place. No more movement of territory. People just stop the fighting where they are. Ukraine agrees not to take back territory militarily. They're not going to continue the war on their side. They'll pursue the return of their territory by diplomatic or other means. And similarly, there's no recognition by the West, no recognition by others in the world about Russia's occupation, saying that's legitimate. No one recognizes Russia's claims to these territories. So you have a ceasefire, non-military use, no recognition, and then trying to put in place some security guarantees for Ukraine that deter Putin from attacking again. Whether that's NATO membership or something less than NATO membership, bilateral guarantees, something that will be sufficient to deter Putin. I think those are the elements of a deal. It's not perfect, it's not fair, it's not going to last forever, but it could actually end the war for a substantial period of time and let people get on with their lives.
Trump has called for NATO to spend 5% of GDP on defense, a significant increase from the 2% he proposed during his first term. The US itself spends around 3.5% or something of its GDP on defense. Do you think Trump's proposed defense spending target for NATO is realistic?
I think it's a good opening gambit. I think it has the shock factor of not 3, not 4, but 5%. People are going to be reacting to that. But it puts on the table the idea we need to see more from Europe. Then you get into a negotiation. I don't think that 5% will be the outcome of such a negotiation. It will probably be 3, 3.5, something like that. Mm-hmm. Europe has underinvested in defense for decades. So just until the past few years, only 3 or 4 countries in NATO were spending 2% of GDP on defense. So there's a gap in equipment, there's a gap in personnel, there's a gap in infrastructure, and these are gaps that need to be closed given the capacity that Russia has and their intention to continue this war in Europe. So there is a reason for this.
And also, many in South Korea interpret this as a sign that Trump intends to demand higher defense cost sharing from South Korea as well. Trump has previously mentioned seeking $10 billion in cost sharing, 9 times that current amount. Is this feasible?
Well, I think, again, 10 times the current amount. That's like saying 5% of GDP from Europe. It's a big number. It's a shock factor. I don't think it's realistic, but it puts on the table the idea that there needs to be some rebalancing here, some better burden sharing. That, I think, is realistic, and I think something the Trump administration will pursue. Where it ends up, probably far less than 10 times the current value.
커트 볼커 전 미국 우크라이나 협상 특별대표와의 인터뷰를 통해 트럼프의 생각을 미리 엿볼 수 있는 기회가 되었으면 합니다. 오늘 특종의 발견은 여기까지입니다.
북한의 가족.
훈련인 줄 알고 러시아에 왔다는 북한군 포로 신문 내용이 공개되면서 북한군의 러시아 파병이 사실상 공식 확인됐습니다.
여기 지휘관들 모자는 뭐라고 그랬어요? 누구랑 싸운다고 했어요?
훈련을 실전처럼 해본다고 했어요.
그동안 우크라이나군이 공개한 영상에서 첨단전에 적응이 안 된 북한군이 허허벌판에서 드론 공격에 속수무책으로 당하는 모습이 공개되었습니다. 젤렌스키 우크라이나 대통령은 북한은 국민을 소중하게 여기지 않는다며 북한군 사상자가 4,000명에 이른다고 주장하기도 했습니다. 미국 워싱턴 포스트는 우크라이나 특수부대원을 인터뷰해 파병 북한군이 포로가 되기보다는 죽음을 택하며 싸운다고 보도했습니다. 옆에서 전우가 다치거나 숨져도 무시하고 전진한다며 한 북한군은 생포되기 직전에 수류탄으로 자결했다고도 했습니다. 영국 더타임스도 우크라이나군 장교의 발언을 인용해 북한군이 총알받이 전술을 쓰고 있다며 3-4m씩 떨어져 한 줄로 걸어가다 한 명이 폭사하면 의무병이 뒤에서 시체를 수습하면서 차례로 이동한다고 전했습니다. 러시아와 우크라이나는 조기 종전을 공언했던 트럼프 미국 대통령 취임을 앞두고 영토 확보를 위해 사력을 다하는 모습입니다. 마이크 왈츠 트럼프 2기 국가안보보좌관 내정자는 미 ABC 방송과의 인터뷰에서 트럼프 당선인과 푸틴 러시아 대통령이 회동을 준비 중이라고 밝혔습니다.
I do, expect a call at least in the coming days and weeks. So that would be a step. We'll take it from there.
다만 우크라이나 영토에서 모든 러시아군을 몰아내는 건 현실적으로 불가능하다며 외교적 해법을 강조했는데 사실상 양측의 점령지를 인정한 가운데 종전 협상을 구상하는 걸로 보입니다. SBS 김정윤입니다.
파나마의 운하 반환을 요구할 수 있고 희토류가 많은 덴마크령 그린란드는 사고 싶다던 트럼프 당선인이 한 발 더 나갔습니다. 두 곳을 확보하기 위해 군사적 경제적 강압 수단을 배제할 것이냐는 질문에 약속할 수 없다고 답한 겁니다.
I can't assure you on either of those two, but I can say this: we need them for economic security.
같은 날 트럼프 장남은 그린란드를 방문해 덴마크 심기를 건드렸습니다.
Det er deres land, vi taler om her, og det er kun Grønland, der i mine øjne kan bestemme og definere Grønlands fremtid.
트럼프 당선인은 집권 1기 때에도 그린란드 매입을 주장했다가 덴마크와 외교 갈등을 빚기도 했습니다. 파나마는 운하가 협상 대상이 아니라고 반박했고 캐나다도 미국의 51번째 주가 될 가능성은 눈꼽만큼도 없다고 일축했지만 트럼프의 압박은 계속되고 있습니다. 미국 우선주의가 경제 영토 확장을 꾀하는 팽창주의로 변하고 있다는 해석 속에 트럼프는 나토 회원국 방위비 인상을 거듭 압박했습니다.
Well, I think NATO should have 5%. Yeah, they can all afford it, but they should be at 5%, not 2%.
워싱턴을 찾은 안덕근 산업장관은 본격적으로 트럼프 2기 대응에 나섰습니다.
주목받고 있는 우리 조선업 분야 관련해가지고 한미 조선업 분야의 협력 방안에 대해서도 이번에 협의할 계획이 있습니다.
안 장관은 공화당 의원들과 만날 계획이지만 트럼프 정부 장관 내정자와의 면담은 없는 것으로 알려졌습니다. 워싱턴에서 SBS 김용태입니다.